So moving on to the different phases of the cardiac cycle. So you know that cardiac cycle is a term used to describe one single heartbeat. So one single heartbeat is also called a cardiac cycle. The first phase of the cardiac cycle is called joint diastole. Now in joint diastole what happens is both the atria as well as the ventricles momentarily appear to be in a state of rest. That means the muscles of the atria as well as the muscles of the ventricles are in a state of relaxation. Now we shall focus specifically on the ventricles. So we shall divide this joint diastole phase into a phase that is referred to as the ventricular diastole. So if you consider this phase where the ventricle is in a process of relaxation, we can divide this phase into two distinct stages. One is called the early ventricular diastole and one is called the late ventricular diastole. So you all can imagine that when the ventricle begins to start undergoing relaxation, imagine that they are relaxing now, the pressure will slightly drop in the ventricle. So please remember that there is a drop in the pressure in the ventricle. That is because it starts relaxing during the early stage of ventricular diastole. The pressure that drops is below that of the pressure in the arteries, that is the pulmonary artery and the systemic, the systemic aorta. And as a result, what happens here is the semilunar valve closes. So please remember, it is during the early diastole when the pressure in the ventricle starts dropping, it reaches a point below the pressure in the systemic aorta and the pulmonary artery. That is when this semilunar valve closes, and this creates a heart sound that is referred to as the dup. It is the shortest heart sound which lasts for about 0.10 seconds. So now you know that it is due to the closure of the semilunar valve. What happens during the late ventricular diastole? The late ventricular diastole, the pressure further drops within the ventricle, and you can see over here when the pressure further drops, the AV valves finally open. It's like the floodgates are open, and when the AV valves open, as you can see, about 70% of the blood will flow down from the atria, that is above, to the ventricles below. Now why did the AV valve open during the late ventricular diastole? Because the pressure in the ventricle has fallen further below. So this is the event. You need to focus more on what is happening on the ventricular side during the joint diastole. Now we saw that 70% of the blood had flown in during the ventricular diastole, in the late ventricular diastole. Now the next phase of cardiac cycle we would consider is atrial systole, and this is when the atria undergo contraction further. So imagine that you are squeezing in the atria and you're pushing in additional volume of blood into the ventricle from the respective atria, and already 70% of the blood had flown into the ventricle passively. That was called passive filling. And now when the atria starts pumping or exhibits contractile activity, 30% excess blood is pushed into the ventricle, and this is not called passive filling. This is called active filling, because passively it flew in, that is during the blood passed down into the ventricle during the late ventricular diastole, but now it is actively flowing down. That is because of the pumping action, the contractile action of the wall of the atria. So this is called the atrial systole. Noteworthy here is that the semilunar valve is anyway closed. It closed in the previous phase during the early ventricular diastole, and the AV valve, which opened during the late ventricular diastole, is still open because the blood is being pushed down into the ventricles. And then obviously the last and the most important, the critical phase of cardiac cycle is where the ventricles are now going to contract. Imagine if the ventricular musculature contracts, whatever blood has been collected by the ventricle is forced into the respective artery. And you know, in this ventricular systole also we can classify two distinct phases. One is referred to as the early ventricular systole and the late ventricular systole. In early ventricular systole, the pressure just about starts rising. In late ventricular systole, the pressure is very, very high in the ventricle. You can remember it like this, that during the early ventricular systole, the pressure is just about higher for what valves to close? For the AV valves to close. This is a very important thing because this creates the first heart sound that is referred to as, that is referred to as the lub heart sound, which lasts for 0.16 to about zero point 0.9 seconds. So why does the AV valve close? Because the pressure is building up in the ventricle and the pressure is just higher than the atria, and therefore the AV valves close, and that is so that the blood doesn't go back into the atria. What happens during the late ventricular systole when the pressure in the ventricle is very high? This pressure is so high that it exceeds the pressure in the respective arteries, and you can see what happens over here. The semilunar valves open. So why should the lunar valves open over here? So that the blood can push, or the blood can be pumped into the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle and into the systemic artery from the left ventricle. So please remember, in the early phase the AV valves close, creating the first heart sound that is called the lub sound, and in the second phase the pressure in the ventricle is so high that it exceeds the pressure in the respective arteries, systemic aorta and pulmonary artery, and thus it forces open the semilunar valve to push the blood into the respective artery. And anyway, by that time the AV valve has already closed, so there is no question of the blood going back into the atria. So three distinct phases. One is joint diastole, in which focus more on ventricular diastole, that will help you understand the valvular activity, and then comes atrial systole, and the last part, which is called the ventricular systole, which actually pumps the blood into the arteries, which carries the blood. Say the pulmonary artery carries the deoxygenated blood to your lungs, and the systemic aorta carries the oxygenated blood to all the parts of your body, so that your body tissues can be delivered with the much needed oxygen.